She seemed weak and innocent until her tiger tattoo told the galaxy the truth. The cargo bay doors had barely opened when the insults began. Sierra Voss stepped onto Voss 9 with a single duffel bag over one shoulder and a datapad tucked under her arm. She was small. She knew that. She had always known that. In a galaxy full of creatures that stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, she measured a modest 1.65 meters, and she weighed less than most of the cargo crates being dragged past her on the loading dock. The Vreth dock worker who nearly walked into her did not apologize. He looked down at her the way one might look at a piece of debris that had inconveniently rolled into a walkway. He said something in the Vreth tongue to his colleague, and they both made a sound that passed for laughter in their species. Sierra smiled at them. She kept walking. The customs line at Gate 7 moved slowly. An Ilari officer with pale silver eyes and an expression of polished boredom processed every arrival with the same mechanical efficiency. When Sierra placed her credentials on the scanner, the officer barely glanced at them. He stamped her clearance, slid the card back, and had already moved on before Sierra had even picked it up. She had been on the station for 11 minutes, and she had already been invisible to 2 species. She was not bothered by this. Being invisible had its uses. The commerce floor of Voss 9 stretched out ahead of her like a living thing. Hundreds of traders, brokers, and merchants moved through the wide corridors under the pale blue glow of the station's overhead panels. The air smelled like recycled oxygen and engine coolant, and something faintly sweet that Sierra had never been able to identify, no matter how many times she had visited. She had a meeting in 40 minutes. A contract negotiation with a Cordon merchant named Getharal, who controlled the redistribution rights for 3 of the most profitable cargo routes in this sector. He had reached out to her because her reputation as a broker was good. She had closed 14 deals in the past 8 months, every single one of them clean, on time, and profitable for both sides. She was good at her job, she knew that too. Getharal's office sat on the upper ring of the commerce floor, behind a heavy door with a glowing orange lock panel. His assistant, a narrow-shouldered Ilari, looked at Sierra with open confusion when she arrived, as if a human had not been expected, as if the name on the appointment had somehow not communicated what she was. Getharal himself was enormous. That was the first thing anyone noticed about the Cordon. They filled rooms. He had a broad, ridged forehead, deep-set black eyes, and hands that could likely crush the datapad Sierra was carrying without much effort. He looked at her the way people looked at something that did not match the story they had been told. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. "You are the broker," he said. "I am," Sierra said. He sat back and gestured lazily at the chair across from him. Sierra sat down. She placed the datapad on the table between them and opened the contract file. The negotiation took 25 minutes. Sierra had reviewed the route schedules, the cargo classifications, the seasonal demand shifts, and the current going rates across 4 competing hubs. She came prepared, as she always did. She made her proposal clearly, supported every figure with data, and left space for Getharal to respond. He countered with a number that was 14% below what the market supported, not because the market had changed, because he had decided, somewhere between looking at her and opening his mouth, that she would accept it. Sierra looked at the number on the display. She looked at him. "That is not right," she said simply. "That is my offer," he said. There was a flatness to his voice that made it clear he was not interested in further discussion. "The current rate for this route, cross-referenced across 6 active brokers on this station, is 16% higher than what you have written here," Sierra said. "I can show you the data." Getharal waved one large hand as though brushing away something small and unimportant. "The offer stands." Sierra did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward or shift in her seat. She closed the contract file on her datapad and stood up. "I will give you 1 cycle to correct it," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then made a short sound that might have been a laugh. He said nothing else. She walked out. In the corridor outside, a cordon station enforcer was leaning against the wall, reviewing something on a wrist panel. He was broad-shouldered, scarred along the jaw, and wore the gray and black uniform of VOS 9's private security force. His name tag read Braxall. He looked up at her as she passed. His gaze dropped briefly to her left arm, where the sleeve of her jacket had ridden up just past the wrist. He could see the edge of something there. Black ink, a line of bold, curving strokes that hinted at something larger beneath the fabric. "What is that?" he asked, not rudely, genuinely curious the way someone reaches for a word they do not know yet. Sierra paused. She glanced down at her arm, then back at him. "An animal," she said, "from my home planet." Braxall tilted his head. "A livestock animal, something your people keep for food." Sierra was quiet for a moment, not because she did not have an answer, because she was deciding which answer to give. "Not exactly," she said. She pulled the sleeve down, tucked her datapad under her arm, and walked on. Braxall watched her go. He looked at the spot where her arm had been. Then he looked back down the corridor at the long, busy stretch of the commerce floor, where she had already disappeared into the crowd. Something about the way she had said those two words stayed with him for the rest of the shift. He could not explain why, but something in her voice had not sounded like a person who had just been turned away from a bad deal. It had sounded like a person who had just decided something. Getherol did not wait one cycle. By the time Sierra had returned to her rented quarters on the station's mid-ring, she already had a notification on her datapad. The message was from VOS 9's Commerce Authority. Her broker license had been flagged for review following a formal complaint filed by a registered cordon trading house. The complaint cited three things: irregular pricing demands, aggressive negotiation conduct, and failure to reach an agreement under standard conclave trading protocols. None of those things were true. Sierra read the complaint twice, slowly, and then set the datapad down on the small desk next to the viewport. Outside, the gas giant that the station orbited glowed in wide bands of amber and rust. She had always found it beautiful, in the way that large, indifferent things could be beautiful. It did not care about her license. It did not care about Getherol or his complaint or the political connections he had spent years building inside VOS 9's administration. She picked the datapad back up. She had work to do. 3 levels below Sierra's quarters, in a narrow archive alcove buried in the station's research wing, a woman named Thessaly was trying not to be distracted. Thessaly was Elari, which meant she was gifted with the kind of precise, long-range memory that most other species considered almost unfair. She had been a data broker and cultural archivist for 22 years. She had filed records on hundreds of species, dozens of political shifts, and more contract disputes than she could count without actually counting. She had not intended to look up the human file. She had been passing through the commerce floor that afternoon when she saw the small human woman walk out of Getherol's office with a datapad under her arm and an expression that Thessaly had never seen before. Not on a human. Not on anything that had just been offered a lowball contract by a cordon trading house and refused it. Most species showed some form of distress in those situations. Frustration, agitation, withdrawal. Humans especially were known for emotional volatility. The conclave's official assessment said so clearly. But this human's face had been perfectly still, not blank, still. There was a difference. Blank was nothing. Still was something held very carefully in place. So Thessaly had gone back to her archive alcove, pulled up the conclave xenobiology database, and opened the file on humanity. It was thin. Embarrassingly, almost insultingly thin for a species that had been part of the conclave network for 30 years. The assessment had been completed in year 1 of human contact. The evaluating team had spent 4 months observing a mid-sized human settlement on the eastern coast of their primary continent. They had noted the soft body structure, the limited physical strength compared to most conclave species, the apparent dependency on tools and technology, and the high frequency of what the report called emotional episodes. Threat level minimal. Thessaly read the summary twice, then she went looking for older records. What she found had not been filed under the official conclave system. It was buried in the exploratory archive, a set of long-range survey logs from a probe that had quietly observed Earth's northern hemisphere 2 centuries before first contact. The logs were dry and technical, written in the flat language of automated systems that recorded everything and understood nothing. But the data they contained was not flat at all. Humans, the probe had recorded, maintained voluntary companionship with a range of animals that other species would classify as active threats. Large, predatory creatures that could cause serious physical harm were kept in human homes, fed daily, and treated with what the probe's behavioral analysis software had flagged as genuine affection. The humans called them pets. The software had noted this and flagged it as anomalous, then moved on. Thessaly did not move on. She pulled the biological file next. Human endurance data. Running distances completed voluntarily during events the humans called races, for no survival purpose whatsoever. Distances that would push most conclave species into total physical shutdown. The humans had crowds watching. They cheered each other forward. Some of them wept when they crossed the finish line. She pulled the medical file. Human response under combat and survival stress. The results were strange. Most species, when subjected to serious physical injury, experienced a shutting down of complex thought as the nervous system redirected its resources. Humans did the opposite. Certain hormonal responses during high-threat situations appeared to sharpen human cognitive function, accelerate reaction time, and in some documented cases produce a near-complete suspension of pain response. They did not slow down when they were hurt. They moved faster. Thessaly sat back in her chair. Through the thin wall of her archive alcove, she could hear the low hum of the station's ventilation system. She looked at the long, scrolling column of human biological data and thought about the woman on the commerce floor. She pulled one more file. Animal records from Earth's pre-industrial period, cross-referenced with human cultural documentation. The tiger. She found it immediately. It had been one of the planet's top land predators for millions of years. A solitary hunter, precise and patient and extraordinarily capable. It had shared a planet with early humans for tens of thousands of years, and the relationship between them had not been peaceful. Then, in the last 150 years of Earth's pre-contact period, the tiger population had collapsed, not because of a natural event, because humans had expanded across the land the tigers needed, and the tigers had paid for it. By the time the probe surveyed the planet, the remaining animals lived in protected areas specifically maintained and funded by humans who had recognized what was happening and refused to let it continue. They had nearly lost the tiger, and instead of accepting that, they had fought to bring it back. And then they had put it on their bodies, ink pressed permanently into skin, not as a trophy, not as a warning, as a reminder, as a way of saying, "This matters. I will not forget what we almost let disappear." Thessaly thought about the tattoo she had glimpsed on the human woman's arm as she passed through the commerce floor. The bold black and orange lines curling from wrist to shoulder. She thought about Getharol's complaint, about the way the Conclave database had categorized this species as minimal threat in 4 months, based on watching them in a settlement on one coast of one continent. She opened a new file and started writing. Across the station, in a different corridor entirely, Sira was not resting. She had pulled every piece of public contract data available for Getharol's trading house for the last 2 years. She was not looking for anything specific. She was just reading, carefully. The way someone reads when they already suspect there is something to find. By the third hour she had found it. 3 separate filing inconsistencies, 2 overdue disclosure reports, 1 contract clause that, under conclave commercial law, constituted a direct violation of fair trading standards. She documented everything, organized it cleanly, attached every supporting record, and prepared a formal counterfiling to the Commerce Authority. Then she ordered a meal, ate it at her desk, and went to sleep. When Braxall came to find her early the next cycle with a warning that Getharol was planning to escalate things beyond legal paperwork, she was already dressed, already caffeinated, and already 3 steps ahead. She listened to his warning. She nodded. She glanced down at the tiger on her arm for just a moment. "Good," she said quietly. "I was starting to wonder when it would get interesting." Braxall opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had the distinct feeling that he had just been the last person on the station to understand something important. The lower freight decks of Vos 9 were not a place most people went by choice. They sat deep in the station's underbelly, past the service tunnels and the maintenance corridors and the heavy pressure doors that kept the clean upper levels separate from the industrial ones below. The air down there smelled like grease and heat. The overhead lights were yellow-tinged and too far apart, leaving long stretches of corridor in shadows that shifted when the ventilation fans turned. Getharol had not come himself. Sira had not expected him to. He had sent 3 cordon enforcers. She saw them the moment she turned into the freight corridor, right where the message through an intermediary had directed her to attend what had been described as a conflict resolution meeting. She had known what the meeting was before she arrived. She had come anyway. The 3 enforcers were large, even by cordon standards. The one in the center stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, with a reinforced chest beneath his jacket and arms that were roughly the width of Sira's torso. The 2 flanking him were no smaller. They spread out slowly as she approached, covering the width of the corridor with practiced ease. This was not their first meeting of this kind. The one in the center spoke first. "You are going to withdraw your counterfiling," he said. "You are going to contact the Commerce Authority and tell them you made an error. Then you are going to leave Vos 9. Sira stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the corridor with her hands at her sides and looked at all 3 of them in turn. "I appreciate the directness," she said. "That is actually one thing I genuinely respect about the cordon." None of them smiled. The center enforcer took 1 step forward. He was close enough now that his shadow covered her completely. "This is not a negotiation," he said. "No," Sira agreed, "it is not." She had been in difficult situations before. That was not a special thing about her. It was a human thing. Humans had evolved on a world that had spent millions of years trying to remove them from it, and they had developed, somewhere deep in the architecture of their nervous system, a response to immediate threat that did not work the way most species expected. It did not freeze her. It did not scatter her thoughts. It focused everything. Every sense sharpened. Every detail became precise and close and clear, even the things sitting at the edge of the corridor's shadow. She saw the pressure valve on the wall to her left. She saw the cargo strap hanging loose from an overhead rack, its free end dangling at roughly chest height. She saw the uneven floor seam 3 steps back, where the deck plating had been repaired and sat slightly raised. She saw everything. The enforcer on her right moved first. What happened next was not graceful. It was not clean. But it was fast, and it was completely effective, and it told anyone watching something important about what a human being could do when every part of them was fully awake and fully engaged. She stepped into the movement instead of away from it, which the enforcer had not expected. She dropped her weight and drove her shoulder into the inside of his reach, redirecting his momentum past her and into the corridor wall. His own size worked against him. She was already moving before he had recovered. The cargo strap came off the rack in one pull. She used it on the second enforcer as he came in from the left, looping it around his leading arm and using the length to break his balance before he could bring his full strength forward. He outweighed her significantly. It did not matter. Weight was entirely irrelevant when balance was already gone. The third enforcer, the one in the center, was the most careful. He had watched the first two and had stopped. He was recalibrating. Sierra could see it in the way his weight shifted back slightly, reassessing. She gave him 1 second, then she moved. She went low and fast, not directly at him, but toward the floor seam she had noted earlier, using it as a pivot point to shift her angle sharply. He turned to follow, and she used the pressure valve handle on the wall to push off and redirect again, coming in behind his reach where he had no leverage. It took another 30 seconds. At the end of those 30 seconds, all 3 cordon enforcers were on the floor. 2 were winded. 1 had a sprained wrist from the cargo strap. None were seriously hurt. Sierra had been deliberate about that, not out of softness but out of practicality. Witnesses who could speak were far more useful than ones who could not. She stood in the center of the corridor and pulled out her datapad. She opened the recording application she had activated before entering the corridor. Every second of the encounter had been logged with a timestamp and location data, already synced to the station's external server. She reviewed the footage briefly, confirmed the audio quality, and prepared the file for transmission to station security. The enforcer nearest to her was watching her do this. He was the center one, the largest of the 3. His eyes tracked from the datapad to her face, and then down to her left arm, where the jacket sleeve had come up during the encounter. The tiger was fully visible now. Black and bold against her skin, it stretched from her wrist all the way up past her elbow. The muscular shoulders and broad face of the animal captured in ink with a detail that made it look, in the yellow freight deck light, almost as if it were breathing. The enforcer stared at it, then he looked back at her face. "What are you?" he said. His voice was rough and genuinely confused. Sierra crouched down until she was at his eye level. She did not do it to intimidate him. She did it because she was about to say something, and she wanted to say it clearly. "I am human," she said. "My species named ourselves after the idea of being human. We thought that was worth making into its own word." She stood back up. She contacted station security directly, reported the attempted intimidation with full evidence attached, and requested a medical team for 3 cordon individuals with minor injuries in Corridor 17 of the lower freight deck. Then she walked to the far end of the corridor and sat on a cargo crate to wait. She looked at the tiger on her arm. In the yellow light, it looked exactly like what it was. An animal that had endured for millions of years on a difficult planet. An animal her species had nearly lost and then spent generations of effort to bring back. An animal that had never once needed to announce itself, because what it was spoke entirely on its own. The security team came through the upper corridor doorway. Sierra smoothed down her sleeve, picked up her datapad and stood up to meet them. The conclave arbitration chamber on VOS 9 was a long, high-ceilinged room with pale gray walls and rows of elevated seating that curved around a central floor. It had been designed to accommodate species of many different sizes, which meant that Sierra, seated at the broker's table with her datapad and a glass of water, looked especially small in the chair. She did not mind. She was used to rooms that were not built for her scale. The arbitration session lasted 4 hours. The Commerce Authority representative, a senior Elari official with gray-streaked skin and a formal measured tone, worked through the case methodically. Sierra had prepared with precision. Her counterfiling was thorough, clearly organized, and legally exact. For every claim in Getharol's original complaint, she had a corresponding document that addressed it directly. For every violation she had identified in his own trading records, she had the supporting data already attached. Getharol sat across the chamber with 2 attorneys and a political liaison. He looked, For the first time since Sira had met him, like someone who had expected a short trip and was discovering it would be a very long one. By the end of the session, the arbitration panel had cleared Sira's broker license, opened a formal audit on Getharal's trading house, suspended his license in the 3 affected sectors pending the audit outcome, and issued a reparations order payable to Sira within 30 cycles. It was legally complete, clean, documented, and final. Sira thanked the panel, gathered her documents, and walked out. 3 levels below the chamber, at nearly the same hour, Thessaly had gathered a small audience. It had not been a planned gathering. She had mentioned to 2 colleagues that morning that she had found something significant in the archive, and the word had moved through the research wing the way interesting things always moved in closed spaces. By midday, there were 11 people seated in the reading room adjacent to her alcove. A Vreth historian who specialized in pre-contact civilizations, 2 Alari economists, a young Cordon trade student who had heard about the encounter in the lower freight deck and was trying to understand how the outcome had been possible. Thessaly stood at the front of the room with a projection panel behind her and a cup of cooling tea she kept forgetting to drink. "I want to talk about a species assessment," she said, "specifically about why ours was wrong." She put the conclave's official human profile on the panel. She let them read it. She watched their faces as they did. Most of them had seen it before, or something like it. It had shaped the standard view of humanity across the conclave network for 30 years. Then she started talking. She walked them through the biological data first, because numbers were easy to verify and difficult to dismiss. Human endurance metrics that exceeded what should have been physically possible for their body structure. Response data under injury and stress that defied the standard model of incapacitation. Cardiovascular output measurements that the original probe software had initially flagged as sensor errors, because the readings matched nothing in any known baseline for a species of their size. Then she talked about their history. They were not born into an easy world, she said. They shared their planet with animals that could have ended them, and they endured anyway. They went through cycles of devastating conflict between their own groups, and they endured those too. They suffered diseases that removed large portions of their population, and they found solutions and kept going. She paused and let that sit in the room for a moment. "But here is what I found most remarkable," she continued. "They did not only survive, they created. While they were in conflict, while they were sick, while they were afraid, they were also writing stories. They were drawing on stone walls. They were making music with instruments they shaped by hand. They were asking each other in every language they developed what it meant to be alive and whether it was worth the effort." She brought up the section on the tiger. "This is the animal on the human woman's arm," she said. She let them look at the photographs, drawn from Earth's oldest nature archives. A large, striped land predator at the top of its environment's food chain for millions of years. Patient, solitary, and quietly powerful in a way that the images communicated even in still frame. In the last 2 centuries before contact, humans very nearly lost this animal entirely. Not through cruelty, through expansion and carelessness. When they understood what was happening, a significant portion of their population responded with something that I believe deserves careful examination. She looked around the room. "They felt responsible," she said. "Not legally responsible, morally responsible. They created protected habitats, dedicated funding and scientific research across multiple generations, and worked to recover the population. An animal that had harmed humans before and could do so again. They protected it anyway because they believed the world was diminished without it. And then," she said, "they carried it on their bodies permanently, ink pressed into skin that cannot be removed, not as a display of power, not as a warning to others, as a personal act of memory, so they would never stop knowing what had almost been lost." The room was very quiet. The conclave assessed humanity as minimal threat because an evaluating team watched them in one settlement for 4 months, Thessaly said. They saw small, soft-bodied beings who mourned their dead and argued in public and needed tools for most tasks. They concluded that this was the complete picture. She closed the projection panel. "We did not ask the right questions," she said. "We looked at the surface and assumed we had seen the depth." On the station's upper observation deck, far from the reading room, Sierra stood at the viewport with her hands resting in her jacket pockets. She held a photograph, small and printed on actual paper, the way her grandmother had always preferred. It showed a tiger standing in long golden grass in late afternoon light, inside a wildlife reserve on Earth. Her grandmother had worked at that reserve for 19 years, helping to run the recovery program. She had sent Sierra this photograph when Sierra was 7 years old, with a note on the back that said simply, "Look what we saved." Sierra looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in her inside pocket, close to her ribs. She looked at her reflection in the viewport glass. Behind it, the amber gas giant rolled its slow, ancient path through the dark. Beyond the station and the trade routes and the political systems of the conclave, there was a planet with grass and rain, and tigers walking through reserves maintained by people who had decided that some things were worth every effort it took to protect them. She touched the ink on her arm once lightly, through her sleeve. Then she went back inside to prepare tomorrow's contracts. Word traveled fast on VOS 9. Not through official channels. Those moved slowly and were written in language that almost no one read voluntarily. Word traveled the way it always had on stations like this one, through service corridors and food dispensaries, and late-shift conversations between traders who had heard something from someone who had heard it from someone else. What the word said was this: a human broker had arrived on the station, been offered a dishonest contract by a cordon trading house, declined it, been reported to the Commerce Authority, and then, over the course of a single station cycle, had dismantled the entire legal and financial standing of that trading house using nothing but public records and a precise understanding of conclave contract law. And that was before anyone reached the part about the lower freight deck. By the time the story had completed 2 circuits around the commerce floor, certain details had grown in the retelling. Sierra ignored those. Exaggeration was what people did with stories that surprised them. It was, she thought, a very human habit. She was oddly pleased to see it spread across species. The mood on the station had shifted in a way that was not simple to name. It was not fear. It was not open hostility. It was closer to the particular feeling a room gets when someone realizes that the person they had been casually overlooking had been paying close and careful attention the entire time. Traders who passed Sierra in the corridors now met her eyes. That was new. Small gestures easy to miss, but Sierra missed very little. On the 4th day after the arbitration ruling, Braxall found her in the station's lower canteen, seated at a corner table with a meal and a datapad. He asked if he could sit. She gestured at the chair across from her without looking up. He sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Braxall was not a being who found silence uncomfortable. Sierra was not either. They sat across from each other with that silence between them, and it was a reasonably honest silence. Then Braxall said, "Why do you hide what you are?" Sierra looked up from her meal. She tilted her head slightly. "I do not," she said. "You allowed them to believe you were harmless." "I am harmless," she said. "When people act right, I am genuinely and completely harmless. I broker deals. I share meals. I keep my word and I expect others to keep theirs." She paused. "Humans love sharing food, by the way. It is one of the ways we say we trust someone. I would offer you something now, but I was not sure if you would appreciate the gesture." Braxall looked at the table. Then, after a moment, he reached across and took a piece of bread from the edge of her tray. Sierra smiled. It was a real one. "I only become something else," she continued, "when someone decides to make me. That is not hiding. That is simply how the 2 parts of me exist in the same space. Most of the time, only one of them is needed." Braxall chewed the bread slowly. He looked at her arm. The sleeve had been pushed back slightly and the tiger was visible from the wrist upward, black and detailed against her skin. "This animal," he said, "it was the same way." Sierra's eyes moved to his face with a new kind of attention. "It did not announce itself to everything it passed," Braxall said carefully, choosing his words with the deliberate weight of someone translating from a private language. "It moved through its world without making a display. It was only dangerous when a situation required it to be." He paused. "And when it was, the announcement was not necessary. The outcome said everything that needed to be said." Sierra said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the tiger on her arm. Then she looked back at him, and the smile she gave him was warm and wide and carried, just at its edges, something that was not quite sharp but was not entirely soft either. "Now you are asking the right questions," she said. Braxall held that sentence in his mind. He turned it over carefully, the way one handles something that is light but unexpectedly significant. He stood to leave, then he stopped. "The cordon have a word," he said. "For someone whose strength is not visible from the outside, it translates roughly as, the one the ground has always known about but the sky has not yet noticed." He looked at her steadily. "We do not give that word to those outside our people. We do not give it often at all." He held her gaze for one more moment. "I will use it for you when I tell this story." He left without waiting for her response. Sierra sat alone with her meal and her datapad and the tiger on her arm, and she was quiet for a long time after he was gone. 3 weeks later, Thessaly submitted her completed research to the Conclave Academic Network. It was 37 pages, thoroughly cited and written in the careful, dry language that academic submissions required. The title was plain: A Corrected Profile on the Nature of Human Beings. It did not stay quiet for long. Within 10 days it had been accessed by researchers, military analysts, diplomatic offices, and trade guilds across 17 conclave member systems. It was discussed in academic forums and station lounges and closed-door briefings in offices whose names were not on any public directory. Some who read it found it alarming. Some found it deeply fascinating. A few found it embarrassing, particularly those whose names appeared on the original 4-month assessment filed 30 years prior. A Vreth military analyst sent a short internal memo to his commanding office that contained 3 words: reassess, reassess now. 3 conclave diplomatic teams quietly requested updated briefings on humanity. 2 trade guilds revised their standard negotiation frameworks for human counterparts, removing a section that had been titled, with considerable inaccuracy, Approaching from a Position of Advantage. None of these changes were announced publicly. They happened the way most truly important things happened, without ceremony, in the spaces between official decisions, where the real adjustments were always made. On Voss 9, Sierra closed a new contract with an Elari trading cooperative. Fair terms, both sides satisfied. When she shook hands with her new partner, a careful and precise woman named Oren, she noticed that Oren had clearly done her reading. The way she had structured the negotiation, the way she matched Sierra figure for figure, the measured respect she brought to every exchange. She had not arrived to take advantage of a small, soft-bodied human. She had come to trade with someone she had already decided to treat as an equal. Sierra appreciated that more than she showed. When the paperwork was signed and the meeting was closing, Oren looked at the tattoo, not rudely, with the quiet interest of someone who now understood, at least in part, what she was looking at. "It is beautiful," Oren said. "Yes," Sierra said. She looked at it herself for a moment, the way she sometimes did, as if checking that it was still there. "It was nearly gone once. We almost lost it entirely." "But you did not," Oren said. "No," Sierra said, "we did not." She picked up her datapad and walked out into the wide, busy corridor of the commerce floor, where 100 different species moved and traded and argued and negotiated under the pale blue glow of the overhead panels. She walked among them the way she always had, unhurried, attentive, smiling at the ones who met her eyes, which was far more of them now than it had been 1 week ago. Somewhere on her arm, a tiger moved in silence through the long amber dark, the way it had moved for millions of years across a planet that had not been easy and had not been forgiving, and had shaped everything that walked its surface into something that could endure, patient and sure and entirely at peace with what it was. It had never needed to explain itself. It had never needed to make an announcement. The world had always known it was there. It had simply been waiting for the rest of the galaxy to catch up.